As an addendum to our class, I wanted to address one category that we did not mention yesterday, and that is redemption. It's a central category for both Nietzsche's Case of Wagner and Adorno's Fantasia Sopra Carmen. To help define what's meant by redemption, at least in the Adorno, but also with respect to the Nietzsche, we have as an additional reading on canvas a short essay fragment by Walter Benjamin called the Theologico-political fragment. That's very influential for Adorno and which reflects back on the philosophy of history and its relationship to religious theological concepts. So here is Benjamin, the theologico-political fragment. Only the Messiah himself consummates all history, in the sense that he alone redeems, completes, creates its relation to the messianic. For this reason, nothing historical can relate itself on its own account to anything messianic. Therefore, the kingdom of God is not the telos of the historical dynamic. It cannot be set as the goal. From the standpoint of history, it is not the goal, but the end. Therefore, the order of the profane cannot be built up on the idea of the divine kingdom, and therefore theocracy has no political, but only religious meaning. To have repudiated with utmost vehemence the political significance of theocracy is the cardinal merit of Bloch's Spirit of Utopia. The order of the profane should be erected on the idea of happiness. Okay, so what Benjamin is saying here is that there's a contrast between the profane dynamic of history and the sacred or religious or theological meaning of history. So the sacred and the profane, these would be opposed categories of anthropology, of culture. So all cultures have always had a distinction between what is sacred and what is profane. So here Benjamin is invoking the profane, which in this context means the secular world, the world of actual historical temporality and time, as opposed to the sacred world, which is a world of eternal values. So in the West, temporal authority would be secular authority, political authority, and religious authority would be celestial authority. So the authority of the church is celestial, meaning eternal like the stars. So here, history cannot have the Messiah or the kingdom of God as a goal within secular time, within historical temporality, but only as a function of the end of time, the end of history. So divine creation at the beginning and divine redemption at the end. So setting up a contrast here between the messianic, which redeems, and the secular historical dynamic. Now, redeeming in what sense? Redeem what? So that's where that final line that I quoted, the order of the profane, which he thinks is the historical, should be erected on the idea of happiness. So he's setting up a contrast between happiness and redemption. So this world of temporality might be the world of happiness, and the world beyond time, outside of time, the eternal world of the sacred, would be about redemption redemption we will see of unhappiness, redemption of suffering, redemption in the afterlife for the suffering of this life, redemption of temporal suffering in the profane world by eternal value, immortality in the next world, or in the world outside of and beyond historical time. Here's Benjamin continuing. The relation of this order to the Messianic, the order of the profane, to the Messianic, is one of the essential teachings of the philosophy of history. This would, of course, be, in our course, Hegel's philosophy of history. So the relation between the profane and the Messianic, one of the essential teachings of the philosophy of history. The relation of the profane, secular, historical order with redemption is one of the essential teachings of the philosophy of history. It is the precondition, Benjamin continues, of a mystical conception of history, containing a problem that can be represented figuratively. If one arrow points to the goal towards which the profane dynamic acts, and the other marks the direction of messianic intensity, then certainly the quest of free humanity for happiness runs counter to the messianic direction. But just as a force can, through acting, increase another that is acting in the opposite direction, so the order of the profane assists, through being profane, the coming of the messianic kingdom. So what is he saying here? So the direction of the quest of free humanity for happiness. Notice the connection between freedom and happiness. So the quest for freedom, the quest of free humanity in history is for happiness. The quest for happiness is a quest for freedom, in the way Benjamin is posing it here, which runs contrary to the messianic direction, which is the direction of redemption at the end of time. So the progress of history is, as Hegel put it, progress in consciousness of freedom. And that occurs through the quest for happiness. That is the opposite force, opposite direction from the eternal redemption, the messianic, the kingdom of God, outside of historical time and temporality. So he continues, the profane, therefore, although not itself a category of this kingdom, is a decisive category of its quietest approach. For in happiness, all that is earthly seeks its downfall, and only in good fortune is its downfall destined to find it. Whereas, admittedly, the immediate messianic intensity of the heart, of the inner man in isolation, passes through misfortune as suffering. To the spiritual restitutio in integrum, that's the restitution of bodily integrity, which introduces immortality, corresponds a worldly restitution that leads to the eternity of downfall. And the rhythm of this eternally transient worldly existence, transient in its totality, in its spatial, but also in its temporal totality, the rhythm of messianic nature is happiness. For nature is messianic by reason of its eternal and total passing away. Okay, so this is quite dense. What does he mean here? So happiness and unhappiness are connected in downfall. Downfall whether in good fortune or in misfortune. Suffering. Suffering is inextricable from happiness. In temporal life, in worldly existence, in earthly life, we're destined for happiness and unhappiness. We're destined for good fortune and misfortune. were destined for suffering. It is this that is redeemed in the afterlife, at the end of time, outside of history. So we're restored in our bodies in order to have the earthly happiness that we were denied in life. So I mentioned end of history, beginning of history. Beginning of history would be paradise, would be Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where they did not age, they did not die, they did not get sick. They did not want for anything. God provided them everything. They didn't have biological reproduction. They didn't suffer. They did not suffer. They didn't experience time. They certainly didn't experience time as a function of suffering. There was no history in paradise. There is no history in the Garden of Eden. There is no history at the end of time. In the divine kingdom, where the Messiah redeems the suffering of our temporal existence. Okay, continuing the last sentence of Benjamin's Theologico-political fragment, Benjamin writes, "To strive after such passing, the eternal and total passing away of nature, even for those stages of man that are nature, is the task of world politics, whose method must be called nihilism." Of course, nihilism is the Nietzschean category. World politics, that's Marxism. World politics is Marxism. It's the struggle for socialism, the struggle for communism, the struggle to overcome capitalism. There is no world politics before capitalism. To strive after such passing, the passing away of nature. So there's a quotation from Goethe's Dr. Faustus. Mephistopheles says, "Everything that exists deserves to perish." It's a very famous phrase and work of Goethe, who in many respects is the most famous German author. Engels, Marx's comrade and colleague and collaborator, in his book Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, probably the most well-read, popular exposition of Marxism in the time leading up to Benjamin's historical moment, he quotes Goethe's Dr. Faustus. He quotes Mephistopheles saying that everything that exists deserves to perish. He quotes it favorably. He quotes it as the spirit of the struggle for socialism, the struggle to achieve communism. Everything that exists deserves to perish. Everything that exists will perish. The only question is whether its perishing is deserved or not. Whether it's something that we're striving for or something that just happens to us. Whether it is the passing away of everything perishing in our quest of free humanity for happiness, or whether it is a downfall that merely happens to everything that is temporal in history. All right, so redemption and freedom as opposed values. This is central to both the Nietzsche and the Adorno. Nietzsche, his critique of Wagner, and his celebration of Carmen, and Adorno's response to Nietzsche in the Fantasia Sopra Carmen. So Adorno emphasizes the content of Carmen as freedom. That's the fate of Carmen. Carmen is fated to be free. That is her character. It's also her tragic flaw that leads to her tragic fate, her death. But she chooses death instead of unfreedom. She chooses freedom, which means choosing death. And that gives her death a different quality. A death in freedom rather than a death in unfreedom. Adorno writes at the end of Fantasia Sopra Carmen, this work too redeems. So Bizet's Carmen redeems, meaning what is a pejorative negative category of Nietzsche, or at least apparently so. He attacks Wagner's Parsifal for offering redemption as a kind of recrudescent, if however mythologized and mystified, Christianity. He attacks this theme of redemption. He also attacks the slogan of the Wagnerians upon Wagner's death, who called for redemption for the Redeemer, who identified Wagner himself with redemption, with the Redeemer, namely with Jesus Christ himself. Of course, Nietzsche attacks that, and deservedly so. However, Adorno criticizes Nietzsche for glossing over the inherent relationship, even if in opposition, between freedom and redemption, between happiness and redemption, meaning Nietzsche only one-sidedly attacks Wagner for upholding redemption against happiness and freedom, and one-sidedly, similarly, Nietzsche celebrates Carmen for putting happiness and freedom above redemption. Adorno thinks you can't simply leave it with that opposition. You can't simply celebrate Carmen for its themes and its instantiation, its enactment, musically and dramatically. Musically, its instantiation of the values of happiness and freedom, the quest of free humanity for happiness, as Benjamin put it in Theologico-political fragment. Nor can you identify, as Nietzsche did, Wagner's 1848 radical, anarchist, socialist, Proudhonian. We didn't talk about this. Wagner was a follower of the father of anarchism, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a French radical figure, someone that Marx, by the way, criticized, as did Baudelaire, and as does Nietzsche. So Nietzsche's seeing the intrinsic connection, the continuity between Wagner's early bohemian, radical, revolutionary politics and his last work, which seems to be, this was mentioned in class, the rejection of revolutionary politics in favor of a Schopenhauerian philosophy, but in fact there's still a connection there, meaning the bohemian radicalism might be a continuation of a Christian demand for redemption, and the rejection of radicalism of politics for a kind of Schopenhauerian resignation and a kind of Buddhist Christianity, the way Nietzsche puts it. It's a kind of modern Christianity that has more in common with Buddhism than with either traditional or original Protestant Christianity, a kind of resignation to the unhappiness of life, a kind of rationalization of it, kind of pseudo-Buddhism and a pseudo-Christianity, in fact, not true to the original spirit of either. That Nietzsche sees these as two sides of the same coin. Now, of course, Adorno would agree with that. However, the answer to that is not life, happiness, freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in the words of the American Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. You can't simply oppose those values to the values of redemption, because history does appear to demand redemption. But redemption of what? Not redemption simply of unhappiness, but redemption of unfreedom. This is where the meaning of Carmen, for Adorno, Carmen also demands redemption and provides the possibility for redemption. That's why Adorno writes this work too redeems. Nietzsche thought redemption as a value was contrary to art, because art should be essentially about happiness and freedom. It should be about that striving for freedom and for happiness. Adorno thinks, well, you can't lose sight of the fact that the meaning of the artwork, art is also motivated by the demand for redemption. Art is also the expression of unhappiness, not just the striving for happiness. It's the expression of unhappiness, which demands redemption. And this, of course, is true for both Wagner's Parsifal, and Carmen. Right, so I wanted to follow up with this idea because it's going to be central for us moving into the later weeks of the course. We'll see in certain respects for Lukács already with the theory of the novel, but especially for Adorno. In his writings on music that we'll be reading, his lyric poetry and society, that essay that we'll be reading, and in his aesthetic theory. So art is about freedom and the pursuit of happiness. It is about life in that Nietzschean sense, but it is also about the demand for redemption of unhappiness, and most importantly, the demand for redemption of unfreedom. So art instantiates striving for happiness, striving for freedom, but it also instantiates unfreedom, unhappiness, and the demand for their redemption.